I'm going to need to sit here.
Right.
All right, we'd like to welcome everybody. And when I say everybody, it's I think they're all here.
Yeah.
Got one more seat over here for somebody. Well, this is the second in our winter lecture series, and we have another program coming up in March, and that will be on March 19th. Bill Monahan and Jeremy Wilson from Indiana will be talking about anthropogenic transformation and population processes at Angel Mounds, the founding, flourishment, and final days of a Mississippian village. So that should be another very interesting program. And we do have a calendar of events out at the front desk for other events and programs that are coming up. So make sure you pick some of those up. Today we have Tamira Brennan, who's with the Illinois State Archaeological Survey, and she's the coordinator for the American Bottom Station. ISAS does a lot of work in this area, and they were the ones that were managing the project in East St. Louis, which you'll be hearing about in more detail today. And they've been doing analysis of all the materials they've excavated, and that will be forthcoming in some publications relatively soon. So we're all looking forward to that. And Tamira did her undergraduate work at Carbondale, SIU Carbondale, UI, and did her graduate degree at Carbondale. And she's worked at many sites throughout the American Bottom region, and I'll let her carry on from here.
Thank you. Thanks. I have a feeling it'll be warm in here.
Yeah.
Don't think you're going to offend me if you start peeling off clothes during the talk. I'll ignore it completely. I'll accept it. I'd like to thank Bill Eisninger and the folks at Cahokia for inviting me here to talk about East St. Louis Mound Complex today. It's really exciting to be giving a talk on East St. Louis at this point in time because our now 8 years long investigation into this site are at the point where we've really dug into the data and we have some new and conclusive things to say about the people who live there and more broadly the cultural development of the region. By we, I mean the Illinois State Archaeological Survey, who spent 4 years excavating over 6,000 features at the site and another 4 years analyzing the artifacts and writing up the results. For those of you who may be hearing about this site for the first time or are generally not familiar with the archaeology of the region, I'll give a brief background of the project, our initial finds, and a very brief culture history of the American Bottom region. If you've already seen one or several presentations on East St. Louis, because we've been doing this for a while now, fear not, I will offer you updates on our research. Key among those are a terminal late woodland period assemblage that hosts items previously thought to occur first in the later Mississippian period, an earliest Mississippian neighborhood that hesitates in fully adopting new Mississippian lifeways, and a peak population that may exceed that estimated for downtown Cahokia itself during one of the phases. See if I can get this guy working. Yes, great. Okay. I'll begin with a brief review of the chronology of this region. We're in times divided into broad cultural periods marked by differing lifeways. In the American Bottom, which is the floodplain east of the Mississippi River from Alton to the north down to Chester in the south, there's evidence of human presence from as early as Paleo-Indian period about 13,000 years ago. These and the subsequent Archaic period peoples are hunter-gatherers who leave little in the way of an archaeological footprint. An exception would be large seasonal archaic base camps that we occasionally find, and there's some notable ones of those in far southern Illinois. The next period is woodland, divided into early, middle, and late, and it's more obvious to find them, especially during the latest period, because these people are semi-sedentary, making their presence easier to identify, because their villages and the refuse they accumulated while they were living there shows up in the ground. From that refuse, we know that they practiced horticulture, meaning they cultivated gardens, but not so intensely or on large enough a scale that they required year-round maintenance. In the small slice of time at the very end of the woodland period, things really intensify in the American Bottom. This period is referred to as the Terminal Light Woodland or sometimes Emergent Mississippian period, and it ranges from about AD 900 to 1050. And the chronology chart there, if you're not wearing your glasses, you probably can't read it. But locally, we have phase names for these. They don't necessarily correspond to the names of these phases anywhere else, which is why we have the more broad woodland, Mississippian, those time periods, which are understood across the southeast and the eastern woodlands. So these smaller phases, for this region, we have Terminal Light Woodland 1 and 2 I'll be talking about. And then the Mississippian from earliest to latest is divided into Loman, Sterling, Moorhead, and the Sand Prairie phases. So the terminal woodland period is where we see the very beginnings of agriculture accompanied by year-round villages, sometimes of substantial size. And this is when the story of East St. Louis really begins. It and the region are best known, however, for the subsequent Mississippian period, during which the large Cahokia Mounds and many other centers like it were built. The region reaches its peak in population and complexity during this time, spanning about AD 1000 to, in this region, 1400. Elsewhere in the southeast, we get a later date, all the way up to Spanish contact in the 1600s. But in this region, people sort of vacate by 1450. Together, the Terminal Lake Woodland and Mississippian periods are the focus of my talk today. But before we get into that, I'm going to cover how it is that we came to dig East St. Louis at all. Any of you who live locally know that the Poplar Street Bridge once carried 3 interstates from Illinois Metro East into St. Louis, Missouri, and was often the site of standstill traffic as a result. Collaborative plans between IDOT, MoDOT, and the Federal Highway Administration to build a new Mississippi River Bridge, which from now on I'll refer to as MRB, because it's easier to say, worked to pull I-70 off the Poplar Street. Here you can see the limits of East St. Louis in light blue as they are impacted by the new I-70 connector, which is in pink, kind of in the center of this image. These plans triggered archaeological investigations into the project's footprint in order to determine whether or not any significant cultural resources might be impacted by the improvements. And there were compelling reasons to think that there might be. Early travelers' accounts indicate that prior to industrial East St. Louis, a vast Native American city with over 50 large mounds existed underneath modern-day East St. Louis. This center was part of a network of sites, large and small, within the American Bottom. The largest of these, of course, is Cahokia, following that East St. Louis, and then St. Louis, which together were precincts of what we now think of as a Native American city. Each red dot you see here represents a known mound, while many undiscovered and now destroyed mounds are not even on this map. Nowhere in the world is there a comparable complex of earthen mounds and associated sites. This knowledge suggested that we were likely to find something in the NMRB corridor. A similarly compelling reason to think perhaps we would not find anything was the fact that nearly the entirety of the footprint of this new grid project was under concrete and standing structures, including the holding pens and other buildings associated with the expansive East St. Louis National Stockyards, which was a waypoint or an endpoint for most of the livestock passing through the Midwest in the 19th to 20th centuries. These stockyards employed thousands of people who built their homes and businesses around their place of work, also impacting what lay beneath. People were originally so confident that the East St. Louis Mound Complex was completely destroyed during the 19th century that when I-5570 was initially built, it carved straight through the heart of the site with no archaeological testing. And this was where all of the largest mounds on the site would have been. Of course, at that point, they were flattened. Although the remnants of them is beneath the road grade, you wouldn't have seen a bunch of obvious mounds. I think if they had, probably the engineers might have diverted their road. Today, laws dictate that testing be done for projects involving federal monies, whether or not a site is even suspected. So when additional work was to be completed in the right-of-way of these interstates in the 1990s, researchers discovered that some of the prehistoric sites still lay buried beneath the modern landscape, including mound remnants. From those excavations, which you can see sort of the white areas on either side of the highway are the areas that were tested, and there's some ongoing excavations there. Beneath the sign for an Egyptian exhibit, which I think is nice. So from those excavations, our impression of East St. Louis was of a city that developed after Cahokia was already established. Most of the finds in that corridor were from the second Sterling phase. And it also was interpreted as a center that served primarily a ceremonial purpose, as little evidence of day-to-day items or activities were found there. There were mound remnants, there were structures, but they didn't have the typical debris that we would find in a domestic house. Testing in 2009 hoped to uncover similar finds to that within the New Bridge corridor, located approximately 500 meters to the northeast of these earlier excavations. And here is 5570. These tiny yellow blocks are the initial excavations. This orange area is the footprint of the MRB excavation. And it was huge, but you have to keep in mind it still only covers 4% of the entire site as we understand it right now. So these 6,000 features are just a minute sample of this enormous site. We never anticipated in digging this that the density or expanse of the site would be what it was. Nearly every square meter of the corridor had features within it. Nor did we anticipate how what we found there would rewrite significant aspects of the American bottom prehistory. Although the project corridor only covered that 4% of the site area, over 6,000 pits, houses, hearths, and other features were uncovered, including about 13 metric tons of artifacts within that fill. And a mound, we found a mound. So that was exciting too. And if you're interested, the publication for that mound is out now. So we got one down, and we're working on the rest right now. So these finds begin within the Terminal Lake Woodland period, starting about 900 AD. And at that time, the site was much smaller than its Mississippian counterpart. So all of these tiny little black dots you see represent houses, pits, and they primarily are restricted to this area here. And prehistorically, Cahokia Creek followed where we've drawn the boundary of the site. So this edge that you see along here where the site stops, these people would have been living creekside, really. Just to give you an idea about the other resources, there's Cahokia Creek. Very near to that, at the time, was the Mississippi River, and over on this side was Indian Lake, which has now been filled in. So basically, 3 boundaries of the site are water. So even though the site is only about 8.4 hectares, the Terminal Lake Woodland site, that's about 16 football fields. So that gives you a better idea if you don't deal in hectares every day. And the Terminal Lake Woodland aspect was about 1,600 features, perhaps housing a population of about 200 to 400 people. The communities here were arranged in courtyard groups, so their houses made sort of an open circle, and there would have been pits in the middle, and might have included extended families sharing resources. Their houses were very small, built primarily for sleeping, and constructed by simply setting small flexible posts in the ground and tying them at the top to make an arbor roof. Even though this terminal village is much smaller than the later Mississippian occupation, it's substantial in terms of its contemporaries and includes several unique aspects that I will discuss later on. Oh, got magic happening that I didn't know about. So this is an example of one of the courtyard groups where these houses clearly form a circle. There's pits inside, and there's about 31 of these groups within this entire village. This is what the footprint of the houses look like. They're pretty small, square, set with single posts. Okay. This map is oriented differently because it wouldn't fit my slide, but this would have been the Terminal Lake Woodland part of the village. And this is the entire, you can see that Mississippian features are with almost the entire footprint, with the exception of right here. And we're not sure why. There was a mound kind of right up there, so maybe that was a plaza or an empty space. So this occupation is much more expansive, and there's often dense superpositioning of later features over earlier ones. It's divided into those 3 local phases. We did not have the 4th Sand Prairie phase. And these are distinguished from one another by marked changes in material culture and site organization that correlate with social and political changes. This image shows the features from all 3 of those phases, but I'll show you maps that divide them out next. There's the mound that we found, right there. This is Main Street, actually, right under there, so it was underneath it. So in the first Loman phase, which lasted only 50 years, there's a flashpoint for region-wide change in lifeways that includes intensive agriculture focused on maize, and more notable status differentiation between certain members of society. At East St. Louis, the houses and pits from this phase are dispersed across all but the southernmost part of the corridor, with an emphasis on the area surrounding the recently discovered mound. So here you can see this is kind of a core area. There's some more focused activity down here surrounding Post Pit, and then all the occupation kind of drops out over there. During this phase, the dimensions of houses and their method of manufacture is another major change. They're now constructed by digging wall trenches for prefabricated walls that would carry a separate roof load instead of being a bent-over arbor roof, and the houses are slightly larger and more rectangular. This may seem like a simple technological progression, but the changes are so rapid and widespread in the American bottom that it's near certain that these were instituted. The pottery also changes with the greater emphasis on jars instead of bowls, and the jars have more pronounced shoulders. Finer attention is paid to the surface finishes and decoration on them, and crushed mussel shell is used to temper the clay as opposed to crushed rock or potsherds, which were previously used. These changes are not wholesale at the very start of the phase at East St. Louis, and there's considerable variability in the pottery early on, which diminishes through time. Okay. The subsequent Sterling phase ushers in markedly different community structure at East St. Louis. The densest occupation takes place in the previously uninhabited area of the corridor down here, where there was no Loman phase structures. This happens to be the area nearest to the ritual precinct uncovered in the 1990s along I-5570. Material culture during this time reaches peak homogeneity, suggesting that production of these items is somehow standardized. So previously, each household or each kin group might have a potter making their vessels, and here that might still be the case, but we get a specialized suite of things that are probably made by a more restricted set of people. The most standardized of these are a novel vessel type, the Ramian-sized vessels you can see here, and also throughout the museum, if you care to walk around. These were incised with iconography that carried a potent message about Mississippian worldviews, and they were likely commissioned by the ruling elite, literally putting the ideology of the elite into the hands of the commoners. Finely made and decorated wares and decorative motifs similar to those from the Caddo region, near present-day Oklahoma and Louisiana, and from the lower Mississippi River Valley are also common. So we've got vessels coming up from the south, vessels coming down from the north even, exhibiting not only long-distance exchange, but also some that were probably produced at Cahokia in foreign styles. Such standardization is also apparent in the layouts of these sites. As you can see from this portion of the southernmost section of the corridor, the buildings are very organized and include special structures used for communal gatherings, ceremonies, purification rituals, such as sweat baths, and more. And the buildings that you see in green have been interpreted, that's not a word, interpreted as domestic structures. And here you can see what's left when you take those away is the non-domestic structures, which are very clearly laid out in a grid. We've got these rows of very large square, maybe council houses, and a number of circular structures of various sizes, as well as these T-shaped things here. This is a really dense non-domestic architecture for an area. So it seems that the closer we get to the main mound precinct for East St. Louis, the more of this we get. And then following that, it seems like the world kind of falls apart. So a prolonged dispersal occurs at Cahokia, and its now sparser population begins to build larger, more square structures during what we call the Moorhead phase, perhaps to accommodate different household composition that includes more extended family. These family groups refocus to local landmarks such as individual mounds, rather than adhering to a site-wide grid. And large palisade walls go up around the central portions of many of the mound centers, although East St. Louis is not one of them. There is a less substantial wall in the central precinct area, but nothing like the palisade we see at Cahokia. This transition is more drastic at East St. Louis than Cahokia. As the 100-year Sterling phase ends, East St. Louis is nearly entirely depopulated with an estimated population of only 40 to 60 people in this little area here. And for comparison, using extrapolation, the estimated population for the Loman phase of the site is between 4,000 and 6,000 people, and during the Sterling phase, between 6,000 and 8,000 people. So they go from 6,000 to 8,000 people to, I think if you extrapolate this to the entire site, which is difficult to do because you can see it's not even, we're talking a couple hundred people. Now, it's entirely possible that, given we only dug 4% of the site, there's a major moorhead occupation somewhere else. But what's important here is that this very popular ritual neighborhood was abandoned. Other evidence suggests that people still used East St. Louis at this time, but more likely as a ceremonial center than that one would visit rather than a place of evidence. Sorry, place of residence. Here and elsewhere, ceramics change markedly again. If you hadn't noticed the theme, when society changes, ceramics change. They don't have mass production, so this really is on a community or household level. The important Ramey jars gain in popularity and eventually disappear, while much simpler jar forms with long diverted lips replace them, as you can see on the right. Servingware such as bowls, plates, and pans take up a much larger portion of the assemblage, and many are larger than is seen in the previous phases. This indicates a shift from consumption in small groups to more communal cooking and eating. A comparison of this moorhead phase pottery between sites in the American Bottom, East St. Louis, Cahokia, and the other sites that have been investigated, reveals that potting overall becomes less standardized, even less so than even during the early Loman phase, which means that the potting communities have returned from an elite-sponsored activity to being entirely household or neighborhood-level endeavor, and probably with less feedback between sites than was seen previously. So now, as I promised, insights and updates. We are finally at a point where everything from East St. Louis has been analyzed, and the reports of our finds are beginning to be published. Each aspect of our analysis provides a different piece of this puzzle, so I'll go through a few of the more spectacular finds now, focusing primarily on what was unexpected and what reshapes our perspective on Greater Cahokia and how it came to begin and end. There we go. I'll start with the terminal late woodland period. Although this period predates Mississippian time, it's not considered to play a huge role in its development across the region. Data from East St. Louis show that many aspects of Mississippian culture once thought to be hallmark to that period are found in the terminal late woodland period at East St. Louis. These include the procurement and use of special resources, such as the Missouri flint clay that was used to carve fertility and warrior figurines found in Mississippian context, primarily at Cahokia, but also at other important sites throughout the southeast. This figurine you see here was found in Mississippian context, but it's a good example of the style I'm talking about and the material. And if you live here, you're lucky enough, you can go to the St. Louis Art Museum and see this on display. It's actually very small, but it's there along with a suite of much larger, similar figurines from throughout the southeast. And it's very rare to get the opportunity to see them all together as an assemblage. So I highly encourage you to do that. It's free, there's no reason why you shouldn't. There's also more exotic items at East St. Louis than any other site during the terminal late woodland period, indicating that East St. Louis was a known center of exchange. Finally, the ubiquity of a certain type of chipstone from the Crescent Hill Quarry, which is in Missouri, not terribly far from here, is greater than at other terminal late woodland sites, and this type of chipstone was favored in Mississippian times. So East St. Louis's inclination or ability to acquire it or have it in greater numbers than elsewhere may have something to do with its later development as a major Mississippian precinct. There are also some other finds that were very unusual for the time period. These include a wide arc-shaped ditch. That's this feature you see here, and it actually comes over and looks like it might connect to both ends of Cahokia Creek. And we don't exactly know what this is for. You would think drainage, but its pitch is not pitched towards the creek to drain it or bring water from it. It's pretty uneven. And there's a similar feature up at the Janie B. Good site, which is not terribly far from this. And those are the two places where we know of them for this time period. There's also many massive pits seen here in light blue and in the photograph. And by massive, I mean you could park a vehicle in them. They really are humongous. This goes down pretty deep there, and they have hundreds of fill zones within them. There's plenty of normal-sized storage pits on site to accommodate the needs of a typical terminal woodland population of this size, so it's likely that these features served an atypical role, perhaps for surplus communal storage. Some deposits found within them include disarticulated human remains, which is not really normal for a terminal lake woodland pit, so their decommissioning may have also been done in a different way than we would expect. Another feature type that's not been firmly documented on this or any other period are extensive series of double rows of shallow pits. By shallow, I mean up to 10 centimeters at the most, a couple inches, whose jagged and pointy profiles suggest they were excavated with a stick or other pointed tool. And you can see the variability here. This looks like someone just stuck a stick in the ground. This one you could have stuck a hoe in and pulled it backwards. This one's jaggedy. These occur primarily in the swales of East St. Louis, which would have held water for part of the year, and form an arc around the terminal lake woodland community. They most likely serve an agricultural purpose, in which case we're seeing cultivation on a scale much larger and more organized than in other terminal villages. Their placement along the perimeter of the village also hints at defense, although this supposition is much more difficult to support. So you can see they're just two rows together. And where they stop here, that's because of modern disturbances. That's not because they actually stopped. So we've got them sort of truncated, and they went like this all the way down to Cahokia Creek. If you've got ideas, we're welcome to take them. Moving on to the transition between terminal late woodland and Mississippian periods, there appears to have been a lot of negotiation as Lifeway site organization and material culture shift to fully loam patterns. In contrast to elsewhere in the American bottom, where sites appear on the landscape fully Mississippianized. Dr. Tim Pocketat refers to this point in time as the Big Bang because the pace of this shift. But at East St. Louis, the transition is irregular and less abrupt. For example, the single post-style houses persist into the loam phase for some time, even in features that have fully loam and ceramic-looking assemblages. These are notably occurring in the footprint of the former terminal late woodland neighborhoods, whereas those structures built outside of this area are wall-trenched construction. This suggests that a portion of the East St. Louis Loman population who are descendants of the terminal late woodland population are holding on to their traditions for a bit, whereas immigrants to the site may be towing the Mississippian line. And we do know there are a number of immigrants to the site, both because of the increase in population could not be attributed to biological reproduction of the terminal community alone, because foreign-looking pottery produced on local clays is present, and also from analyses of the human remains found, we're finding that some of the bones indicate people were raised outside of the area and then came here and eventually died. This unevenness in the adoption of Mississippian traits has significant implications. It could be that the Loman period at East St. Louis begins slightly earlier than the 1050 mark, and so we're simply seeing the formation process of a Mississippian precinct that's not seen on slightly later sites. Or this unevenness may have to do with the fact that East St. Louis is one of the very few sites where there's in situ development of a Loman community from a terminal late woodland one. There are only several other known sites, one of which is Cahokia, and there's not evidence for that here. Although only 1% of Cahokia has been excavated, so we've got excavation bias again. Another thing we can see here, something unusual during the Loman phase, is that this guy, this is just one of 3 examples of these on site. We're calling them longhouses, not as in Iroquoian longhouses, but they're very long houses. And we've not seen them, it's a good word for it. We've not seen them at any other site. They have no basins, so we have no artifacts from them. And it's difficult to say what exactly they were, but they're just huge, and they all seem to date to the Loman phase. So probably another non-domestic type of architecture. We've also got these very large post pits in which marker posts would have been erected, similar to the ones you see at Woodhenge. And this is kind of an early community. This is a giant borrow pit that would have been dirt borrowed for mounds. So we've got these communities kind of organized around post pits as well.